Our gospel reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, verses 27 through 38. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah," or "You are the Christ." And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Gracious God, the gift of your word is a light unto our feet. It is the word of salvation for us. Pour out your Spirit upon us so that our whole lives may be filled with the wonder of your word, with the presence of your living word, Jesus Christ. These things we pray in his name. Amen. Where do words come from? I've been thinking about that. That might be kind of a peculiar question, but I've been thinking about it in light of these three passages that we've heard read this morning. Psalm 19, the passage from James chapter 3, and this passage from Mark. In some way, I think that they're all tied together, at least by the idea of words and the way we hear words spoken about in these passages. Where do words come from? I get an email from dictionary.com, an email every day that gives me a word. And one of the fun things to do, because most of the words I don't know, but one of the fun things to do is to click on it and then read the derivation of the words. And it will also tell you, is it from Latin? Is it from French? Is it from Greek? I looked up the word itself and to see what they said, and it had all kinds of old English references, and even the German word for word. And it's fun to think about how words come to us from different languages, from different times, from different places, from different peoples. Dictionary.com also has, or Merriam-Webster's dictionary has a word of the day that they pick every year. And they look at the statistics and see what word was Googled or researched more than any other word across that year, and then they declare that the word of the year. You know what the word of the year for 2020 was? It's probably easy to guess. Pandemic. That was the word everyone was. I wonder what the word for 2021 will be. Pandemic again, maybe. Who knows? Where do words come from? I think in some sense, words are gifts to us from people who are important in our lives, people who teach us, parents, friends, school teachers, the words they speak to us over time, We're sitting on the edge of our seats whenever we're with our granddaughter, Sydney, waiting to see if she's going to say a word. And so we try to encourage her. Grandpa, Grandpa, make that your first word, okay? Grandpa, Grandpa. Hasn't worked yet, but we teach children our words. When Helen and I were visiting in North Carolina last week with Krista and Kima Hyatt, and they were showing us their new house, and we were going through, and Krista pointed out on a bookshelf a reader that she had from Lake Como Elementary School, first grade, which is where I went to school too, Dick and Jane and all their adventures. Remember the words in Dick and Jane? Ball, see the ball, cat, see the cat. And it was so much fun, a trip down memory lane to look at the pictures and think about the words. Where do words come from? Sometimes words come to us from the events that are taking place around us. What's going on in the world? What's going on in society? And certainly over this past weekend and the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I've been thinking a lot about words. We've heard a lot of different words, and we've been shown and spoken to the words that have rooted themselves in our consciousness and our lives across the years. So many words that have such power and meaning to them now. Hero, heroism. We think about the first responders that rushed into the Twin Towers and other places to rescue. And what do those words mean to us now? And we think about the words that have been spoken across the weekend. Never forget, remember. What do those words mean to us? How have they come to us over the past 20 years? And then there are other words that remind us of the difficulties and challenges and ways perhaps that we've gotten lost over the past 20 years. Words like terror and torture, and words that still confuse us and breed uncertainty, security, and safety. What do these words mean now, and how have they come to us through the events of our lives? It's fun to hear the Child Care Center and hear the words that they use over time with the children as they're coming up through the center. And when they were in the church offices at the beginning of the year for so much time, or sharing offices with us, I heard many of the teachers use a phrase that I'd heard so many times before but had forgotten. When some of the littlest children, 2 years old or maybe even older, 4 years old, had just lost it and were screaming at the top of their lung, just screaming as loud as can be, the teacher would say, "Use your words. Use your words." Very patiently trying to exercise and establish some control over the children. Give them an ability to give voice to and speaking of what's going on with them. It reminded me another phrase that I repeated at our household to our children that I learned from the Child Care Center when they sit down at lunchtime. You get what you get and you don't complain. You just say those words over and over again. You get what you get and you don't complain. Words that have come in helpful. It also reminded me of how we were teaching the children in chapel a number of years ago about the 10 words, the 10 good words, the 10 commandments, and some of what we talked to them about. And you may remember how the third commandment, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain, we used the little symbol W, watch your words. And we tried to talk to the children about watching their words and being careful with their words and how words can hurt and how using names are important. Seemed like it was a little abstract to try and teach the 4-year-olds about using the Lord's name in vain, and we weren't sure how it was really going until a little bit later the teachers pulled me aside and said, "Can you spend a little more time on that commandment? Watch your words. We're having some difficulty with that one." And I said, "Well, what do you mean exactly?" And they said, "You know, that bit about don't take the Lord's name in vain." And I said, "What? That's an issue over in the 4-year-old class?" And they kind of looked at me. Well, they said they hear things at home and they watch TV, and all of a sudden we hear them using that in the class, and maybe you could spend a little time on that. And opened up a whole new idea of the way words come to us and the way we repeat and use words. Be careful about your words. That's one of the things James seems to be saying. Be careful about your words, and in order to be careful about your words, we have to pay attention, James says, to the agent of our speech, to the thing that brings forth so many words. And so he talks about taming your tongue, and what a difficult thing that is to restrain yourself and to keep from letting just whatever in your head come out through your mouth, because it always won't be the best and most helpful thing. James really seems to come down hard, doesn't he, on our inability to keep from saying the wrong things, to keep from saying bad things, to keep from saying pernicious, hurtful things. And so he describes the tongue as a restless thing, something that's pernicious, something that's evil. And you wonder, well, is there anything good that can come out of our mouths? And it's like John Walker said in Sunday school class earlier today, maybe we should just take a vow of silence and live like that. But James especially points out this action of blessing God on the one hand and then turning around and cursing somebody else immediately after that. James says you can't do that. You can't have a blessing coming out of your mouth for God 1 second and then turning around and cursing somebody else. If there's one thing James is specific about, he says, folks, let's not do this. This cannot be. And it makes you ask, is it just that James wants us to use good words versus bad words? And if you think about it, it really has more to do with James' sense that there needs to be coherence within our very selves. And if the Spirit of God is at work within us, that Spirit is the Spirit has to come forth out through our words and interactions with people. It can't be something else coming out if the Spirit of God is within us. And the point James seems to want to emphasize is be whole. Be whole in your very self. And if your very self is given to God, let that come to expression in the words that you speak to others. And that's true for the things that we've heard James say in the 2 previous sermons when Linda talked about the importance of the heart being pure and a pure and clean heart producing righteous acts. And when Helen talked last week about James saying, we can't have empty words. You can't have words that just aren't connected with actions. The two have to go together, faith and works. And James seems to be saying something of that again today. Yourselves have to be whole. And there has to be a consistent reflection of who you are inwardly as who you are as well outwardly. It's not easy to do. Not easy to do at all. You know that as well as I do. Even 2 weeks ago, when Helen and I were at a conference in Montreat, one of the exercises that we were called to do in the conference was hear a little bit of a presentation on the art of conversation. And the instructor talked to us about ways that we could learn to converse and listen in a better way when we're talking with other people, and the importance of that. And they said the obvious. Don't listen to try and interject yourself immediately into the conversation as soon as the other person takes a breath. Really listen. Allow yourself to be present to the other person who'll be speaking to you. And then they said, now, you take a few minutes and go pair up with somebody and spend some time practicing this conversation. And I had paired up with a young Presbyterian Korean pastor, and we began to talk, and as we began to talk, it took me about 15 seconds to say, now I told us not to do this, but here's an idea that I really want to talk to you about. And he said, that's okay, I understand. And 15 seconds later, now they told us not to interject ourselves, but here's something I'm really thinking about. And so I was able to say, I heard what they're saying, I just can't find a way to put it in practice as we're talking with each other. It's not easy to let ourselves be a coherent reflection of the Spirit of God at work in us so that the world knows who it is that's moving in our life, in our very being. That kind of concern with James, I think, in many ways is reflected in the psalm with which we began, Psalm 19. Creation itself is praising God. Look at the sky. Look at the wonders in the world. They all proclaim God's glory, God's goodness. There is no speech, the psalmist says. There are no words, yet their voice goes throughout the world, throughout the earth. And it's as though in the psalmist's very words of praise, he gives voice to the praise of creation itself. Creation's silent praise becomes vocal in the words of the psalmist and becomes the psalmist's praise as well. And then the psalmist moves into the second part of the psalm, which we didn't hear, but which is so important, to praise of God's Torah, praise of God's instruction, praise of God's words in our lives. And some of you may remember the imagery of those words. The word of the Lord is more precious than gold. The word of the Lord is sweeter than honey. The word of the Lord is good and true. And then the psalmist says, and in keeping them, in keeping these words, and letting them be the animating power of your life, there is great reward. It's such a delight to see the Piazza family here this morning after the celebration of Patricia and Benjamin's wedding yesterday. And Patricia and Benjamin, are you here? I thought so. Would you just stand? Because I want the folks to see you. And one of the points I want to make is that now in their physical presence here today, they are embodying many of the words that were spoken yesterday in their wedding. Not just Patricia and Benjamin, but the whole family, because so many of the family came up and said to us, you know, we're going to come to church tomorrow. We're going to come to church tomorrow. And they did. Their words were truthful. Their words were honest. And here they are, bringing their very selves into our presence, into this presence of worship as an act of God. But there were so many other words in the ceremony yesterday, which seemed to me to give such a vivid example of the power of God to shape our lives and what we're due. One of the sisters, the aunties, Samilia, spoke yesterday as she began to read from Paul's 13th letter to the Corinthians, the chapter of love. Samilia, who some of you longer members of Park Lake knew her when she was a little girl, running around the aisle here in the chancel area and going to Sunday school and youth group next door. She got up and she read from this love passage, but she prefaced it by saying, now the reason, Samilia, I hope I get your words right, but she prefaced it by saying, we know that the reason that we're all here is because of what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. And it was through God's gift and the righteousness of God given to us in Jesus Christ that we are here today. And we can understand and hear these words of Paul about love. Do you see how Samilia's words were affirming and shaping the very reality of the gathering of worship and the need for that worship to be open to the words of Paul about love? I was in the sound room and Helen was in the congregation and we were texting each other while Samilia was talking. We weren't supposed to be doing that, but we were. And Helen texted me, Samilia's preaching now. Boy, she's really going at it, isn't she? And she was, proclaiming the word to us. And then the pastor who was officiating at the service, Pastor Jimmy Hawkins, what a beautiful service he had, what a wonderful wedding. And I was listening to everything he was saying, thinking, I need to say that at my next wedding I officiate. I need to say that at the next wedding I officiate, trying to write some of them down. And then he spoke to Benjamin and Patricia, not just the traditional vows, which we often use, which sometimes seem a little abstract and, kind of words of advice to follow. But he went and had them repeat these words from the book of Ruth. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee. And then Benjamin said, entreat me not to leave thee. Repeat after me. Entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. And those words spoken by Benjamin and Patricia are becoming embodied in their lives even today as they come and join together in worship with us. You see the power of these words to begin to shape life and make us particular, distinct people who know who God is and know what God calls us to do. Then we come to the Gospel of Mark, and we hear again words that are familiar to us there. One scholar has called this passage from Mark's Gospel the most verbally abusive passage in the Bible. An interesting description, and he calls it that because of the way the word for, in some translations, rebuke, or in some other translations, shut up, is used, or be quiet is used. 3 times when Peter confesses Jesus to be the Messiah, the Christ, Jesus says, we're going to keep this quiet. Be quiet. This is something that everyone won't be able to hear or understand or comprehend or embrace at this time. And then Jesus goes on to use his own words to describe what Messiah and Christ will mean, how he will be arrested and tried and crucified and killed by the leaders, by the chief priests, by the scribes of Israel, and how he will die and rise after 3 days. And what does Peter do but then turn around and rebuke him and tell Jesus to be quiet? No, you can't use those kind of words with Messiah and Christ. Those aren't the words that I'm thinking of that are meant by Messiah and Christ. And then Jesus turns again on Peter and rebukes and tells him to be quiet. No, these words are going to be the words that I say they are, and they're going to mean what I say they mean, and you, Peter, are going to have to follow me. And then into the famous words of Jesus, if anyone wants to be my disciple, let them deny themselves, pick up their cross, and follow me. But the words that really have caught my attention in the passage this week come more at the end, when Jesus says, if anyone is ashamed of me and of my words. I've been wondering, what words of Jesus might we be ashamed of in the world today? What words is Jesus calling us to embody that might give us hesitation, that might give us pause for thought, caution? Words like sacrifice, words like forgiveness, words like grace, words like love, words like follow, words like cross. Do we pause at all when we hear Jesus speak those words to us? Do we experience in any way the kind of new life those words may be opening to us? It made me think about a scene from an old movie that some of you may have seen or maybe heard about, a movie called The Miracle Worker, the story of Helen Keller's life, a movie starring Anne Bancroft as Anne Sullivan and Patty Duke Austin as Helen Keller. And some of you will remember the incredible scene in that movie when Helen Keller first learns the significance of words and how to put words and the letter actions that her teacher's been doing in her hand, how to put them together with the things that they seem to be signifying. You remember Helen Keller had been raised as a little child since she was 19 months old to just do whatever she wanted because she could neither hear nor see, and she became a terribly unruly child, and her parents had hired this teacher to come from Boston and try and teach her. And Anne Sullivan had this finger language that she would do in her hand to try and spell letters of the words that meant things, at the same time trying to exercise some control over Helen. And then in this scene, they're standing next to a water pump, and Anne Sullivan is making the pump go as fast as she can so that the water will run over Helen Keller's hands. And Helen Keller's trying to pull away until all of a sudden she stops. And she lets the water come over her hands, and then she reaches out and she grabs Anne Sullivan's hand, and she starts to make the letters for W-A-T-E-R in her teacher's hand. And when she does, her teacher says yes, nods her head and shakes Anne's head, and suddenly it's as though a whole new world opens up for Helen Keller, and then she starts to run to other objects and pat them, and then go make those same shapes in her teacher's hand, running around the yard, earth, tree, all the different things that she can find. Helen Keller wrote about this in her own autobiography, and she said, suddenly I felt a misty consciousness of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened in my soul, gave it light and hope and joy, and it set me free. I've been wondering if it's too much for us to say that God moves in our hearts, and God moves in our lives, and God moves in the world. Like Anne Sullivan motioning with her fingers in Helen Keller's hand. God is moving in such a way that we come to know that J-E-S-U-S does embody forgiveness and grace and hope and love in our lives. J-E-S-U-S, that Jesus does become the living presence of God for us, and it awakens our souls, and it gives us light and hope and joy and sets us free. Free in the power of the Word, free to hear Jesus' words, to hear Jesus say again, if any would be my disciple, let them pick up their cross and follow me, to hear the challenge of that, to hear the truth of that, to hear the risk of that, to hear what it might mean for us, what it calls us to. Is that the way God is moving in us and in the world? I have this image of you leaving here today, and some of you may have a purse, some of you may have a wallet, some of you may have a satchel, a backpack, a briefcase. You're all going to be leaving here today, and I wonder if you'll be carrying words with you. And then at some point in the week, or maybe not long after you walk out the door, you're going to need a word, and you're going to open up that purse, and you're going to look for a word. You're going to reach in your wallet, and you're going to look for a word. You turn your cell phone on, and you're going to look for a word there. And there's going to be all kinds of words. Get over it. Move out of my way. You knucklehead, slow down. Don't cut me off. You don't know what you're talking about. You couldn't be more wrong. All kinds of words. But might there also be other words that you've heard here today? Words that can become a part of your story. Faith, hope, love, forgiveness, sacrifice, grace, Christ, follow. Might you look in there and find those words and bring them forward as a way for you to be in the world, as a way for you to be able to say with the psalmist, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O God, my rock and my redeemer. Can you make an offering of yourself in that way? If so, then you may be able to be where James says you need to be. Receiving with meekness the living word implanted in you with the power to save your souls. Amen.